Did Tutankhamun invent Art Deco? This video will explore Egyptomania in the global north, which appropriated the imagery circulated from the pandemonium of one of the most global-scale excavations of a single figure the world has ever seen. This Egyptomania was kicked into a frenzy thanks to the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb by British archaeologist and Egyptologist Howard Carter in 1922. We're going to look at the Carrera's cigarette factory and Le Luxor cinema, built 7 years apart in London and Paris. What can they tell us about the convergence of cultures in modern life, and the relationship between Art Deco and Egypt? First, let's contextualise Egyptomania. You may have heard of Philip Glass's Akhenaten, now an oft-performed contemporary opera. The eponymous pharaoh Akhenaten ushered in a new style during his reign in the new kingdom of Egypt's 18th dynasty. He altered attitudes to religion, ways of life, and art. I'll leave it up to you to watch the stunning opera and learn of his tumultuous story. It was his son, Tutankhamun, who was buried in the tomb that went on to captivate audiences on a global scale. And why the tomb of Tutankhamun above everyone else? Well, his tomb, embedded within the Valley of Kings, amongst his successors and predecessors as pharaoh, was found to be the most substantially intact, buried with golden riches and beautifully crafted artefacts. On top of this, the archaeological project in the early 20s involved immensely heavy media coverage. Photographer Harry Burton was brought in to photograph the process, employing cutting-edge lighting techniques that were being used in Hollywood at the time. On top of this, the fashion world had their eyes peeled. The now well-known image of the modern woman, the flapper girl, the woman independent, was in part modelled after the Egyptian women in the art discovered in these excavations. The case was an international spotlight, and thus, as we can imagine, the styles and influence of the immense findings trickled into all corners of visual culture. Egypt at the time was under British colonial rule, and although they were granted independence a mere few months before Tutankhamun's tomb was found, they still were under heavy influence from the British government until 1956. Thus, surprise, surprise, the relationship between the searching white archaeologists and the country itself was a one-way system of power and rule. The discipline of Egyptology, that of being an expert in Egypt and its history, is a field of study which has its roots in Europe. In the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, one must remember that Egyptology, starting in 1821, grew up during the African slave trade, the Sugar Empire, and the Cotton Kingdom. There was only one actual Egyptian archaeologist working on the excavation of Tutankhamun. Likewise, as with the general self-conflated greed of colonialism at large, the images that inspired many cultural waves in the global north in the 20s during Egyptomania were more often than not stolen, ultimately ending up in the hands of the culture of the colonizer. The Luxor cinema was designed by Henry Zipke and completed in 1921. The exterior boasts impressive formulaic mosaics featuring serpents, papyrus, and other creatures like winged scarab beetles. There is intricate metalwork which greets its visitors, as well as an overwhelming golden hue throughout which invites us into the cosy interiors of the cinema experience, which was in somewhat of a heyday in France at the time. The interiors that you see here, which are the ones from today, are a reimagining, on account of the many changing stages the building went through. In the 70s, the cinema showed only Arab and Egyptian movies, until it shut in 1983 with the film Kaidi. Throughout the 80s, the building became a kind of gay capital of the Paris nightclub scene. It was Antillean run and supposedly hosted many Caribbean dancehall nights. After this sadly closed down, it became a squat and grew into a state of dilapidation, until it was refurbed in 2003 in its newly impeccable painted form, and it's still open today, if you ever find yourself in Paris. The Neo-Egyptian motifs employed in Le Luxor cinema were equally reflective of the popularity of Egypt as a subject in cinema over the course of the turn of the century. Scholar Antonia Lant noted that the basic narrative of ancient Egypt was as familiar to audiences as the Grimm's fairy tales at the time. It is said that the inspiration for Le Luxor was Cleopatra, starring Theda Bara. Cinema Le Luxor sees a congruence of a tripartite popularity between Art Deco, Egypt, and cinema at the time. The ancient Egyptian motifs are modelled geometrically, which lends well to the mosaic of the exterior. But it is really the style of Art Deco which is characterised by decisive angular shapes and equally bold colours. At the same time, being transplanted into both another time and another place is evocative of the medium of cinema, not to mention the abundance of animalistic features throughout, like the spread wings and beaming rays of sun, which further transport us elsewhere. The cinema doesn't stand alone in Paris in its culturally appropriative design. La Pagode, a cinema in the 7th arrondissement, was in action until 2015, another feast for the eyes. So if anyone has any money to give out there, go to Le Luxor, witness the history of the place, the glamour it contributes to the cinema experience, and maybe think about refurbing and totally reopening the place for us. The Carrera's cigarette factory fits a slightly less magical purpose, though I suppose that entirely lies in your personal opinions on nicotine. Amazingly, British Pathé have footage of the Carrera's cigarette factory available to watch in full colour, though the video we see before us here is of the factory after relocating from Mornington Crescent to Basildon in 1959. I've left the link to the full video and the references in the description. This architectural style, though also Neo-Ancient Egyptian and Art Deco like Le Luxor, is also listed under Egyptian Revival architecture. This style is attributed to the earlier period of public awareness in Europe of Napoleon's conquest of Egypt and bringing over of monuments and architectural styles during the French Revolution. The exterior is monumental, standing opposite Mornington Crescent Station. In a Ghibli-esque styling, there are several cat's heads which poke out of roundels on the facade, mimicking the two more stoic cat figures which flank the entry stairwell. These figures are Bastet, the goddess of protection and good health. The two of them, we could say, protect the building, looking out at the now busy road which leads to Euston in central London. The black cat was the marketing mascot of Carrera's cigarettes, and they even considered calling the building Bast House, but it was quickly dropped due to the verbal similarity to a popular English swear word. The red, blue and green columns you see here are a direct reference to the tomb of Panissi, and across the road from the factory there is a paving stone with signage beneath the Eye of Horus, a symbol of ancient Egypt. The architects on the project were Marcus Evelyn Collins and O.H. Collins. A similar energy took place in this building as with Le Luxor. The Egyptian cigarette industry was vastly popular, to the extent of non-Egyptian tobacco companies adopting Egyptian motifs in their advertising purely to take advantage of the conflation of the country with the product. The black cat supposedly comes from a cat that used to visit the original tobacco shop on Wardour Street. As an honourable mention, we mustn't forget the spectacular Hoover building, now on the A40 motorway, standing as both a Tesco and luxury apartments, but in its original form was a headquarters for the Hoover Company, opening in 1933. It was designed by Wallace Gilbert and Partners, who also did Victoria Coach Station, and the Firestone Tyre Factory. There was a later expansion 5 years after opening as the demand for Hoovers grew. There are also Native American influences on the building, though it is agreed also that most of the features look to Egypt. What do we think about the Egyptian revival in London and Paris? From the golden opulence of Le Luxor cinema in Paris to the monumental Carrera's cigarette factory in London, we've witnessed the echoes of Egypt's allure in the vibrant strokes of Art Deco. These architectural gems not only stand as testaments to the visual feast that was Egyptomania, but also reflect the complexity between cultures in the early 20th century. Stay inspired, quit smoking, and fund local cinemas. I'll see you next time.